Well, today I welcome Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who is an expert military strategist, as well as having, I would argue, perhaps in the modern world, unique combat experience, having commanded an armoured regiment in combat in Iraq, in Desert Storm, and various other things. So he's a man of great experience and great insight. And so it's a great pleasure to have him here. And I'd just like to ask him a few questions and let it roll so he can give an opinion. And you can get his work on my website. You can click in on the website. You can click in and get what he's done in the past. And he's just very recently done a sort of a trilogy on this, which goes into more depth than we'll be able to go into today. But I think you'll find it extremely enlightening, and you'll get that link on my website if you want it, and I suggest you do. Perhaps the first question I would like to ask you, Colonel, if I may, and it's I'm going to be fairly parochial here and talk about Britain a little bit on the British side of these things. What disappoints me is the British are under the impression from the weight of propaganda that one day President Putin was very bored and he woke up because he was bored and decided perhaps to invade the Ukraine to give him something to do for no reason whatsoever. And that appears to be the view that most people in Great Britain have, because that's the view that they've been fed for the last year. It's a question really of a supine mainstream media. And of course, wars, most wars in the modern era are managed to be run on the basis of propaganda and what the masses believe. And we've seen that in the past, and particularly in 1914. And I would like to come back to 1914 because I've read the beginning of your book on Mons and Haldane, and perhaps we could elaborate on that a little bit. But really, it's propaganda and mainstream media, which of course is the same, I'm sure, in America. Am I right?
No, I think you've summed it up reasonably well, although fortunately, there are more and more people who are skeptical of what they're hearing in the media right now. And I think that's because we've had a rather disappointing experience with the media in the past. We have been systematically misinformed in the past about various things, and people are beginning to wake up to it. So the so-called support for Ukraine or for aiding it has eroded substantially.
Good. Well, I'm pleased to see that. It's we have yet to experience this winter where we are suffering from green policies. It's going to be a very cold winter. Fuel is extremely expensive now, which of course the propaganda is feeding into people that it's the war in the Ukraine, which it isn't, because green policies came much before this. This isn't something that's blown up in the last 10 months. This has been going by failed green policies, wind turbines, solar panels, getting rid of coal fire, so on and so forth, and treating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And I think people by the halfway through this winter, will be taking a bigger interest in actually why they're freezing and why they can't afford things. And it's not the Ukraine. So I'm hoping that we will see the same phenomenon of people drawing away from this sort of blind support for the Ukraine. We have people putting blue and yellow flags up in their garden, people who couldn't point to the Ukraine on the map. People with no idea of military history, no idea of Russian history, no idea, frankly, about anything at all. They haven't had the benefit of a traditional education. And so they're falling for this hook, line, and sinker. And of course, this is one of the problems, because we don't have mainstream media defense correspondents, which we used to call them. And I know you were around in the days of, and our leading papers, the Daily Telegraph and the Times of London, we had people like Claire Hollingworth and John Keegan, who was the Sandhurst historian, who could actually analyze things in some depth in the newspapers and get away from this propaganda thing. We don't have people like that now, and it might surprise you to know, and I'm pretty sure it'll be the same in the United States. The London Times, until quite recently, their defence correspondent was a woman called Lucy Fisher. Now, she was very good on handbags. She was excellent on handbags, and nobody would dispute that in ladies' fashion. And I think one day she went to the Christmas party at the Times of London, and somebody said, I think you'd be good on defence. We're going to put you into defence. And Nick Beale at the BBC, and I've crossed swords with him, he doesn't know the difference between a colour sergeant and an able seaman. And when I crossed this on him, he said he doesn't think that's his role. He thinks his role is just to report what's actually happening, not actually take any depth of what has happened, what's happening now, and what might happen in the future. So we have very low-grade defence correspondents. And if you take out the London Times, the Daily Telegraph and BBC, Lord only knows what you're going to get from the Daily Mail and our tabloid newspapers. So nobody seems to actually be taking much notice of this. And until people get properly informed in these matters, I can't see things changing as fast as we need.
Well, even more deeply concerning to me is the absence of any alternative media, particularly in Europe and in Great Britain. If you have only one source, the so-called official government source, whose narrative is embraced wholeheartedly without question by all of the local media, then how can you possibly know what's really happening? Because the government frequently has no interest in sharing the truth. I've been involved in this sort of thing over the last few years. We are very grateful that Elon Musk has invested in Twitter, but we really need much more than that. We need platforms that have been demonetized and eliminated that were sources of the truth that are now no longer available to us. So I hope that in the future we can get some more free speech oriented people with money to help bring back these free speech platforms. Right now, anyone who disagrees with the public narrative, as you know, is immediately cast as a Putin agent or a fascist or some other ridiculous remark. This is extremely unhelpful. And you're right, the people putting up the blue and yellow flags don't know what they're doing. It was a healthier environment in Great Britain when someone would have stood up and said, do we have any particular interest in Eastern Ukraine? And of course, in Parliament, you had dead silence because there was no commercial interest in Eastern Ukraine. I remember, well, I can't remember it, but I remember reading about it. Palmerston, who was brought into Parliament in 1864, because there were a number of hotheads in the Parliament who wanted Britain to join with the Danes in a war against Austria and Prussia. Palmerston, of course, rightly thought that was insane. And he agreed he would come and speak. And he pointed out, you can envision this very easily. He pointed out, oh, yes, we could send 150,000 men or 120,000 men, and there's no doubt that our men would give a good account of themselves. Everyone, of course, said, here, 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 here. He said, but the question is, to what purpose? What would they achieve? How could they possibly prevail against the forces of Austria and Prussia? Nations larger, more populous, with larger armies than we have. Would we really be helping the Danes very much? Or should we instead urge the Danes to do the best they can, but to accept a peace early rather than later? So, we had people like Palmerston, Disraeli, even Gladstone could be rational on occasion. And of course, you've had Campbell Bannerman, who was a wonderful prime minister, who was publicly scorned because he apologized for putting Boer women and children into camps during the Boer War, but he did the right thing. And thankfully, as a result, the Boers in South Africa stood the course with Great Britain during World War I. I just don't see statesmen anywhere in the West today. I'm talking about statesmen, not politicians. Politicians are always in abundance, but statesmen think more clearly. They ask the hard questions. They're not simply there to propagandize for a specific purpose. Now, on our television, we have lots of general officers, retired, who come on and paint the grim picture for the Russians and keep telling everyone Ukraine is winning. In fact, the joke here is that since 24 February, this has been one long march to Ukrainian victory, which of course is absurd. Well, that's because most of these general officers are on the payroll of the defense industries and various think tanks that we privately refer to as advocacy tanks. And most of the so-called think tanks in Washington advocate for more war, more intervention, more conflict that we can involve ourselves in. So I think this is now coming to an end, frankly, because we're just about financially broken. We're talking about a $31 trillion national sovereign debt. That puts us right up there with Great Britain in 1947, when the debt to GDP ratio for Great Britain after World War II was 240%, largely thanks to us, since Franklin Roosevelt wanted to destroy the British Empire and saw running Britain into debt as a way to do that. So I think this is beginning to come to an end here. And most Americans, frankly, as you point out, don't know where Ukraine is and could care less. Americans are far more concerned about what's happening here. I imagine that will eventually happen where you are. If so, that's a good thing. But it is disturbing that this Western elite, this ruling class that we're dealing with, wants so desperately to involve us in a conflict with a major power like Russia. It's one thing to involve us in these wars of choice, these low-intensity conflicts against enemies that have no means of fighting back. I'm talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. Effectively, in military terms, it's analogous to clubbing baby seals. Well, we're not clubbing baby seals anymore. And the opponent is not incompetent. He's not weak. He's not stupid. And interestingly enough, he also doesn't really want a war with us. He wants to put an end to the threat to his country. And I'm talking about Russia in Ukraine, which we've worked tirelessly over the last 20 years to create and then launch against Russia. I often ask why, and I get confusing responses. Oh, well, they're corrupt. Well, substantial portions of our country are corrupt, and the rest of the world has problems with corruption. Well, they're bad actors. What do you mean they're bad actors? You know, you got on this list of stupid statements. Where do their strategic interests collide with ours? And in most cases, nobody can come up with an intelligent answer. It's a well-financed minority in London, New York City, and Washington that seems very interested in destroying Russia. This has now backfired. Russia is actually stronger today, financially and economically, than it was when the war began. And Russia is going to come out of this event with a much larger, more capable, and more lethal military establishment than it had at the beginning. So everything has backfired and is going to continue to backfire, because we can no longer try to impose American or U.S.-led Anglo-American hegemony on the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't want it. Frankly speaking, we don't need it, and it's bankrupting us. So all of this is going to collapse. It's going to implode. And the Russia war, again, with Ukraine is just going to accelerate the process.